The morning of December 3rd, 1984, began like any other in Bhopal, India. Children slept in their beds, mothers prepared for the day ahead, fathers finished their night shifts at local factories. The Union Carbide pesticide plant, an American-owned facility that had been operating in the heart of this densely populated city since 1969, hummed with its usual industrial rhythm. But in the early hours of that December morning, something went catastrophically wrong. At approximately 12:30 a.m., water entered Tank 610, which contained 42 tons of methyl isocyanate, a highly toxic chemical used in pesticide production. The reaction was immediate and violent. Temperatures inside the tank soared, pressure built beyond what the aging safety systems could contain, and then, in a moment that would come to define industrial negligence for generations, the tank ruptured. 40 tons of deadly gas began pouring into the night air of Bhopal. Ahmed Khan was sleeping in the Jayaprakash Nagar neighborhood, less than 2 kilometers from the plant. He was awakened by a burning sensation in his eyes, a feeling he later described as though someone had poured hot peppers directly into them. His wife, Rashida, was already coughing uncontrollably. Their 3 children were crying in terror. Ahmed grabbed his youngest son, just 4 years old, and ran into the street. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The streets were filled with people running in blind panic, many of them already collapsed on the ground, their bodies convulsing. The gas, heavier than air, hugged the ground, concentrating in the poorest neighborhoods where residents lived in single-story dwellings with no protection from the toxic cloud. Ahmed ran with his family, not knowing which direction was safe, watching neighbors fall beside him. His youngest son stopped breathing in his arms. By morning, the streets of Bhopal were lined with corpses. The official death toll in the immediate aftermath was 3,787, but independent investigations would later estimate that between 16,000 and 30,000 people died in the days and weeks following the disaster. Over 500,000 people were exposed to the gas. Even today, more than 4 decades later, children are being born with severe birth defects in Bhopal. The groundwater remains contaminated. The death toll continues to climb. Union Carbide, the American corporation that owned the plant, knew the facility was dangerous. Internal documents later revealed that the company had been aware of significant safety problems for years before the disaster. Cost-cutting measures had reduced the workforce responsible for safety. Critical safety systems had been shut down to save money. Refrigeration units designed to keep the methyl isocyanate cool had been turned off 6 months before the disaster. The gas scrubber, meant to neutralize any escaping gas, was undersized and undermaintained. The flare tower, designed to burn off toxic gases, was not operational on the night of the disaster. Warren Anderson, the CEO of Union Carbide at the time of the disaster, flew to India 4 days later. He was arrested by Indian authorities but released on bail within hours. He returned to the United States and never faced trial in India. Despite an extradition request from the Indian government, the United States never handed him over. Anderson died in 2014 at the age of 92, having spent no day in prison for the deaths of tens of thousands of people. The Bhopal disaster stands as one of the starkest examples of a pattern that has repeated throughout modern history. The lives of ordinary people, particularly poor people in developing nations, treated as expendable in the pursuit of profit. But Bhopal was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger story, one that stretches back centuries and continues to unfold today. To understand this story, we must travel back to the late 19th century, to a time when the modern pharmaceutical and chemical industries were being born. In the German city of Leverkusen, a company called Bayer was founded in 1863. Originally a dye manufacturer, Bayer would go on to become one of the most powerful pharmaceutical companies in the world. But Bayer's history contains chapters that its current leadership would prefer to forget. In 1898, Bayer began marketing a new wonder drug called heroin. The company promoted it as a non-addictive alternative to morphine, advertising it as a cough suppressant and pain reliever suitable for children. Bayer knew within years that heroin was highly addictive, but they continued marketing it aggressively until 1910, by which time addiction had become a global epidemic. The company faced no meaningful consequences for its deception. But Bayer's most damning chapter came during World War II. In 1925, Bayer had merged with other German chemical companies to form IG Farben, a conglomerate that would become the largest chemical company in the world and one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the Nazi regime. IG Farben built a synthetic rubber and fuel plant at Auschwitz, using concentration camp prisoners as slave labor. The company worked prisoners to death, then requested fresh. Midgley and his employers at General Motors, along with their partners at Standard Oil, knew the dangers from the start. Workers at the plants manufacturing tetraethyl lead began dying almost immediately. At a Standard Oil facility in New Jersey, workers called the plant the House of Butterflies because so many of them experienced hallucinations before death. In October 1924, 5 workers died and 35 others were hospitalized with severe lead poisoning at that single facility. The public outcry that followed nearly killed the industry. But the companies responded with a public relations campaign that would set the template for corporate denialism. They funded studies by sympathetic researchers. They attacked independent scientists who raised concerns. They created the Lead Industries Association to coordinate their messaging. And they argued that the economic benefits of leaded gasoline outweighed any hypothetical health concerns. The campaign worked. Despite clear evidence of the dangers, leaded gasoline remained legal in the United States until 1996. During the decades it was in use, it released approximately 7 million tons of lead into the American environment. Studies have since linked childhood lead exposure to permanent reductions in IQ, increased rates of learning disabilities, and higher rates of violent crime. The generation of Americans who grew up breathing leaded gasoline exhaust suffered damage that cannot be undone. The men who made these decisions, the executives at General Motors, Standard Oil, and DuPont who knew lead was poisoning children and chose to continue anyway, faced no criminal consequences. Many became wealthy beyond imagination. Alfred P. Sloan, the CEO of General Motors during the period when leaded gasoline was introduced, is remembered today as one of the greatest business leaders in American history. The Sloan School of Management at MIT bears his name. The pattern continues into the present day. In 1995, internal documents from Purdue Pharma showed that the company knew its new pain medication, OxyContin, was being abused and diverted for recreational use. The documents showed that Purdue's sales representatives were instructed to tell doctors that OxyContin was less addictive than other opioids, a claim the company knew was false. Purdue's marketing campaign emphasized prescribing OxyContin for moderate pain, vastly expanding the market for a drug that was originally intended for cancer patients and others with severe chronic pain. The Sackler family, which owned Purdue Pharma, became one of the wealthiest families in America as a result of OxyContin sales. Museums and universities around the world bear the Sackler name, funded by donations from the family's pharmaceutical fortune. Meanwhile, the opioid epidemic that Purdue helped ignite has killed more than 500,000 Americans since 1999, making it the deadliest drug crisis in American history. When the legal consequences finally came, they were remarkably mild. Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to federal criminal charges in 2020 and agreed to pay approximately $8.3 billion in penalties. The company declared bankruptcy. No member of the Sackler family was criminally prosecuted. The family was allowed to keep most of its fortune, estimated at over $10 billion, in exchange for a $6 billion payment to be distributed over time to communities affected by the opioid crisis. The pharmaceutical industry's practices in the developing world have been even more egregious, often conducted far from media scrutiny and legal accountability. In 1996, during a meningitis epidemic in Kano, Nigeria, the American pharmaceutical giant Pfizer saw an opportunity. The company sent a team of researchers to test an experimental antibiotic called Trovan on children infected with meningitis. What happened next would result in one of the most disturbing medical ethics scandals of the modern era. According to lawsuits and investigations that followed, Pfizer's researchers conducted the trial without obtaining proper informed consent from the children's parents. Many parents did not understand that their children were being enrolled in an experiment rather than simply receiving treatment. The standard treatment for meningitis, ceftriaxone, was available and being administered by Doctors Without Borders at a facility next door. But Pfizer's researchers gave some children Trovan and gave others a lower-than-normal dose of ceftriaxone, creating a comparison group that was effectively undertreated. 11 children died during the trial. Others suffered serious complications, including deafness, blindness, and brain damage. Nigerian authorities later concluded that Pfizer had violated international law and Nigerian law by conducting the experiment without proper consent and without ethical approval. Internal documents that emerged during litigation suggested that Pfizer may have backdated an ethics approval letter to cover its tracks. Pfizer denied wrongdoing but eventually settled lawsuits brought by Nigerian families for $75 million, a fraction of the company's annual profits. No Pfizer executive faced criminal prosecution. The company continues to be one of the largest and most profitable pharmaceutical companies in the world. The exploitation of human beings for medical experimentation has a long and horrifying history, one that extends well beyond corporate research. The Tuskegee syphilis study, conducted by the United States Public Health Service from 1932 to 1972, deliberately left black men with syphilis untreated to study the progression of the disease. The study continued for 40 years, even after penicillin became widely available as an effective treatment. Participants were told they were receiving free health care. In reality, they were being used as human guinea pigs, their suffering prolonged so researchers could document the destruction syphilis caused to the human body. The men in the Tuskegee study were poor sharecroppers from Macon County, Alabama. They were chosen precisely because of their vulnerability, because researchers believed they would be unlikely to question medical authority or discover the true nature of the study. By the time the study was finally exposed and shut down in 1972, at least 128 participants had died of syphilis or related complications. 40 of their wives had been infected. 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. The researchers who conducted the Tuskegee study were not Nazi doctors operating in concentration camps. They were respected American physicians working for the federal government. Many went on to have distinguished careers in medicine. None faced criminal prosecution for their participation in what President Bill Clinton would later call one of the most shameful chapters in American medical history. Similar experiments were conducted in Guatemala between 1946 and 1948, when U.S. researchers deliberately infected prisoners, soldiers, and psychiatric patients with syphilis and gonorrhea without their consent. The experiments were funded by the U.S. Public Health Service and conducted with the cooperation of Guatemalan authorities. They were kept secret for decades, only coming to light in 2010 when a researcher discovered them while investigating the Tuskegee study. The Guatemala experiments were overseen by John Charles Cutler, a U.S. Public Health Service physician who would later go on to be a lead researcher in the Tuskegee study. Cutler understood what he was doing was unethical. In correspondence with his superiors, he expressed concern about what might happen if the experiments became public, but he continued anyway, infecting at least 1,308 people with sexually transmitted diseases. At least 83 died. The United States government formally apologized for the Guatemala experiments in 2010. No one was prosecuted. No one went to prison. Cutler, who died in 2003, never faced any consequences for his actions and was never publicly identified as having committed wrongdoing during his lifetime. These historical examples might seem like relics of a less enlightened age, but the exploitation continues today, often in forms that are harder to recognize. The modern global economy has created systems of extraction that channel resources and labor from the poorest parts of the world to the wealthiest, leaving environmental devastation and human suffering in their wake. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, children as young as 6 years old work in cobalt mines, digging the mineral that powers the batteries in smartphones and electric vehicles. A 2016 investigation by Amnesty International found children working in conditions that can only be described as modern slavery, exposed to toxic dust, at constant risk of injury and death from tunnel collapses. The cobalt they extract makes its way through a complex supply chain to companies like Apple, Samsung, Microsoft, and Tesla. The companies at the top of the supply chain have issued statements deploring child labor and promising to ensure their products are ethically sourced, but investigations continue to find children in the mines. A 2020 lawsuit filed by human rights organization International Rights Advocates alleged that Apple, Google, Dell, Microsoft, and Tesla knowingly benefited from child labor in the cobalt supply chain. The lawsuit included testimony from families of children who had been killed or maimed while mining cobalt. The pattern is the same one that has repeated throughout history: powerful institutions making decisions that harm the most vulnerable people on the planet, extracting resources and labor while externalizing the costs onto communities that have no power to object. The children in the cobalt mines of the Congo, like the workers in the Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, like the black men in the Tuskegee study, are treated as expendable inputs in economic systems designed to benefit those at the top. The food system provides another illustration of this pattern. In the years following World War II, American agriculture was transformed by a revolution in chemical inputs. Synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides promised to increase yields and reduce labor costs. The companies that manufactured these chemicals, many of them descended from the same corporations that had produced explosives and chemical weapons during the war, became enormously wealthy. But the transformation of agriculture came with hidden costs that would not become apparent for decades. Rachel Carson documented some of these costs in her book Silent Spring, which revealed the devastating effects of DDT and other pesticides on wildlife and human health. Carson was attacked viciously by the chemical industry, which funded a campaign to discredit her science and destroy her reputation. She was called hysterical, emotional, and unscientific. She was accused of wanting to return humanity to the Dark Ages. Carson died of breast cancer in 1964, 2 years after Silent Spring was published. Her work eventually led to the banning of DDT in the United States in 1972. But the chemical industry's tactics of denial and delay had already been perfected. They would be deployed again and again in the decades that followed, whenever scientific evidence threatened corporate profits. Monsanto, the agricultural giant that would later be acquired by Bayer, provides a case study in these tactics. In 1974, Monsanto introduced Roundup, an herbicide based on the chemical glyphosate. Roundup became the most widely used herbicide in the world, particularly after Monsanto introduced genetically modified crops designed to be resistant to glyphosate. Farmers could spray their fields with Roundup, killing everything except their crops. It seemed like a miracle of modern science. But questions about glyphosate's safety began emerging almost immediately. Independent researchers found evidence that the chemical might cause cancer. Monsanto responded with the same playbook that had worked for the tobacco industry and the lead industry, funding studies designed to cast doubt on the scientific consensus, attacking independent researchers, and lobbying government regulators to prevent restrictions on their product. Internal documents that emerged through litigation revealed the extent of Monsanto's knowledge and deception. A 2015 determination by the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer classified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans. Monsanto's response was furious. The company launched a campaign to discredit the IARC's finding, ghostwriting scientific papers, and paying academics to put their names on them. The lawsuits began arriving in 2018. Dwayne Johnson, a school groundskeeper who had been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma after years of using Roundup, became the first plaintiff to take Monsanto to trial. Johnson's lawyers presented internal documents showing that Monsanto had known about the cancer risk for decades and had actively worked to suppress the information. The jury found in Johnson's favor and awarded him $289 million in damages.
Thousands more lawsuits followed. Bayer, which acquired Monsanto in 2018, has paid more than $10 billion to settle Roundup-related claims. But no Monsanto executive has been criminally prosecuted. The company continues to sell Roundup. Glyphosate remains one of the most widely used chemicals in global agriculture. The climate crisis represents perhaps the most consequential example of this pattern of corporate knowledge, denial, and delayed action. As early as the 1970s, scientists working for ExxonMobil produced remarkably accurate predictions of how burning fossil fuels would warm the planet. Internal documents later revealed that Exxon's own research confirmed the reality of human-caused climate change decades before the company publicly acknowledged it. Rather than warn the public or work to reduce emissions, Exxon and other fossil fuel companies funded a decades-long campaign of climate denial. They created think tanks and front groups to cast doubt on the scientific consensus. They paid scientists to produce studies questioning the link between fossil fuels and warming. They lobbied government officials to prevent regulations that might reduce their profits. A 2017 investigation by Inside Climate News found that Exxon's own scientists had been warning the company about climate change since at least 1977. In that year, a senior Exxon scientist named James Black told the company's management that there is general scientific agreement that the most likely manner in which mankind is influencing the global climate is through carbon dioxide release from the burning of fossil fuels. Black's prediction was accurate. His warning was ignored. Instead of acting on its scientists' warnings, Exxon spent tens of millions of dollars funding organizations that spread climate denial. The company's public position for decades was that the science of climate change remained uncertain and that costly regulations were premature. The consequences of this deception are already being felt around the world. Rising sea levels threaten coastal communities. Extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and more severe. Agricultural systems are being disrupted. Climate refugees are already on the move, fleeing regions that can no longer support human habitation. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change estimates that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius will require cutting global carbon emissions in half by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. The window for avoiding the worst consequences of climate change is closing rapidly. Every year of delay makes the task more difficult and the ultimate consequences more severe. The fossil fuel executives who funded climate denial knew what they were doing. They made a calculated decision that their short-term profits mattered more than the long-term survival of human civilization. It is perhaps the most consequential bet ever made, and ordinary people around the world will pay the price. The patterns documented here raise profound questions about accountability, power, and the value placed on human life. In case after case, we see the same dynamics at play. Powerful institutions making decisions that cause widespread harm, using their resources to suppress evidence and delay accountability, and ultimately escaping meaningful consequences while ordinary people suffer. The victims in these stories share common characteristics. They are disproportionately poor. They are disproportionately non-white. They are disproportionately residents of developing nations or marginalized communities within wealthy nations. The pesticide plant in Bhopal was built in a poor neighborhood precisely because land was cheap and residents had little political power to object. The children in the Tuskegee study were chosen because they were poor black sharecroppers with no access to alternative medical care. The children mining cobalt in the Congo work there because their families are desperate and they have no other options. The perpetrators also share characteristics. They are executives and shareholders in some of the wealthiest corporations on the planet. They have access to the best lawyers, the most sophisticated public relations firms, and the most extensive political connections. When consequences do come, and they rarely do, those consequences tend to be financial rather than criminal,
and the costs are usually passed on to shareholders or absorbed by corporate entities rather than the individuals who made the decisions. This asymmetry of power and accountability creates what might be called a moral hazard at a civilizational scale. When the expected consequences of harmful decisions are minimal, the incentive to avoid those decisions is reduced. When the worst outcome facing a corporate executive who causes thousands of deaths is a negotiated settlement paid by the company's insurance, the calculation changes. Human lives become line items in a cost-benefit analysis. The legal systems that might hold these actors accountable have proven inadequate to the task. Corporate law generally shields executives from personal liability for decisions made in their official capacity. Criminal law requires proving intent, which is difficult when decisions are made through complex organizational processes involving many individuals. International law has no enforcement mechanism capable of holding multinational corporations accountable, and the political systems that might reform these legal frameworks have been captured by the same corporations they should be regulating. The tobacco industry provides a telling example. Despite decades of deception that killed millions, the executives responsible faced no criminal charges. The companies paid billions in settlements, but those payments were structured to be manageable and were ultimately passed on to consumers through higher cigarette prices. The individuals who made the decisions retired wealthy. The pattern continues with opioids, with climate denial, with every new scandal. Some observers have argued that what we are witnessing is not a series of isolated incidents, but a systemic feature of modern capitalism. The legal obligation of corporate executives to maximize shareholder value creates pressure to externalize costs whenever possible. Environmental damage, public health impacts, and human suffering are costs that can be externalized onto communities that lack the power to resist. The result is a system that systematically transfers wealth from the poorest to the richest while treating human beings as resources to be exploited.
This analysis does not require belief in any conspiracy. No secret cabal needs to meet in shadowy rooms to produce these outcomes. The system operates through the ordinary decisions of ordinary people responding to the incentives they face. A chemical company executive who decides to cut costs by reducing safety measures is not evil. He is responding to pressure from shareholders to improve quarterly earnings. A pharmaceutical company that continues marketing a dangerous drug is not part of a plot to harm people. It is protecting its investment in a profitable product. The harm is a byproduct of normal business operations, not a deliberate goal. But the fact that harm is systemic rather than conspiratorial does not make it less real or less deadly. The children who died in Bhopal are just as dead whether Union Carbide intended to kill them or merely treated their deaths as an acceptable cost of doing business. The millions who died from tobacco-related diseases were just as victimized by the industry's deception, whether that deception arose from malice or merely from the desire to protect profits. What the historical record shows is that powerful institutions will consistently prioritize their own interests over human welfare when they believe they can do so without consequences. The only constraint on this behavior is accountability, legal, political, and social accountability that raises the costs of harmful decisions to the point where they become unattractive. Creating this accountability has proven extraordinarily difficult. The institutions that cause harm are the same institutions that fund political campaigns, employ lobbyists, and own media outlets. They have every incentive to prevent the creation of accountability mechanisms and every resource necessary to fight against them. The result is a persistent imbalance of power that allows harmful practices to continue long after they are recognized as harmful. The environmental justice movement has documented how this imbalance plays out in the siting of polluting facilities. Studies consistently show that toxic waste sites, polluting factories, and other environmental hazards are disproportionately located in poor communities and communities of color. This is not coincidental. These communities have less political power to resist unwanted facilities and less access to legal resources to challenge them. The same pattern appears in the global distribution of environmental harm.
The countries that have contributed most to climate change are not the countries that will suffer most from its consequences. The wealthy nations that industrialized first, burning fossil fuels to build their wealth, are generally located in temperate zones that will experience relatively mild impacts. The poorest nations, which contributed least to the problem, are generally located in tropical zones where the impacts will be most severe. The Pacific island nation of Tuvalu provides a vivid illustration. Tuvalu contributes essentially nothing to global carbon emissions. The nation has no heavy industry and a population of less than 12,000. But Tuvalu is already disappearing beneath the rising seas caused by emissions from wealthy nations. Within decades, Tuvalu may become uninhabitable, its people forced to become climate refugees through no fault of their own. The people of Tuvalu have no legal recourse against the companies and countries responsible for their displacement. International law provides no mechanism for holding fossil fuel companies accountable for the damage their products cause in distant nations. The asymmetry could hardly be more stark. The wealthiest corporations in history have made their fortunes selling products that will render entire nations uninhabitable, and they face no meaningful consequences. The response to the COVID-19 pandemic revealed how deeply these patterns are embedded in global systems. When vaccines were developed in record time, wealthy nations bought up the available supply, leaving poorer nations without access. Pharmaceutical companies protected their intellectual property, preventing generic manufacturers from producing vaccines that might have saved millions of lives. The result was a two-tiered pandemic response, in which wealthy nations achieved high vaccination rates, while poor nations struggled to protect their populations. The World Health Organization estimated that vaccine nationalism resulted in millions of preventable deaths in low-income countries. The pharmaceutical companies that developed the vaccines received billions in public funding for their research, but retained full control of the resulting products. The profits from COVID vaccines created new billionaires, while people in poor countries died for lack of access to doses that cost pennies to manufacture. This pattern will repeat itself as climate change creates new crises. The technologies needed to adapt to a warming world, drought-resistant crops, water desalination systems, seawalls, and other infrastructure will be developed and controlled by wealthy corporations in wealthy nations. Access to these technologies will depend on ability to pay. Those who can pay will survive. Those who cannot will be left to suffer the consequences of a crisis they did not create. The question of who is orchestrating humanity's destruction may be the wrong question. What the evidence suggests is not orchestration, but indifference, a systemic indifference to human suffering when that suffering does not threaten the interests of the powerful. No one decided to kill the children of Bhopal. They were simply not considered important enough to protect. No one decided to poison generations of children with leaded gasoline. They were simply not considered important enough to factor into the cost-benefit analysis. This systemic indifference is perhaps more frightening than any conspiracy could be. A conspiracy could be exposed and defeated. Systemic indifference is woven into the fabric of economic and political institutions that millions of people depend on for their livelihoods. Dismantling it would require fundamental transformations in how societies are organized, how economies function, and how power is distributed. Some movements and organizations are working towards these transformations. Environmental justice advocates are fighting to ensure that polluting facilities are not concentrated in poor communities. Climate activists are demanding that fossil fuel companies be held accountable for the damage they have caused. Labor organizers are working to give workers more power relative to the corporations that employ them. Human rights organizations are documenting abuses and pressuring